Imagine being 22 years old, sitting in a wooden cockpit held together with wire and canvas. The engine screaming so loud you can feel in your teeth, and below you, nothing but clouds and the distant thunder of artillery that has already swallowed 3 million men whole. You didn't have to be there. Nobody sent you. Nobody drafted you. Nobody even asked you. You crossed an ocean, lied to border guards, signed papers in a foreign language, and climbed into a machine that had a better-than-average chance of killing you before the enemy ever got a shot off. And you did it because something inside you, something that couldn't be explained at a dinner table back home in Boston or Chicago or New Orleans, told you that this was where you were supposed to be. This is not a story about orders. This is not a story about duty assigned from above. This is a story about young Americans who looked at the most catastrophic war in human history and said, I choose this. I choose to fight, and the world would never forget them. Welcome to the story of the Lafayette Escadrille. Before we go any further, I want you to understand something about the world these men were born into. The United States of America in the early 1900s was a nation deeply, almost philosophically committed to staying out of European wars. President Woodrow Wilson had run for re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." The American public, by and large, agreed with that position. The Atlantic Ocean wasn't just a body of water. It was a psychological wall, a separation between the New World and all the ancient hatreds and imperial ambitions that had been tearing Europe apart for centuries. Most Americans looked at what was happening in France and Belgium and said, that is their problem. That is not our war. But not everyone felt that way. There were young men, hundreds of them, eventually, who felt a pull toward France that they could not rationalize away. Some of them had studied in Paris. Some of them had French heritage going back generations. Some of them had simply read the newspaper reports about German troops burning Belgian villages, about poison gas drifting across trenches filled with dying men, about a civilization being methodically destroyed, and they felt something break inside them. A moral urgency, a rage at injustice, a need to do something more than read about it. And then there were others who felt something even harder to admit. They were drawn to the adventure of it, to the romance, to the sky. Aviation in 1915 was barely 12 years old. The Wright brothers had flown at Kitty Hawk in 1903, and already, impossibly, terrifyingly, human beings were using this fragile new technology to kill each other at altitude. The fighter pilots of the First World War were unlike any soldiers who had ever existed. They were modern knights. They fought one-on-one, man against man, machine against machine, high above the mud and the rats and the gas. They were celebrated in newspapers like athletes. They had names that people whispered with a mixture of fear and awe. And for a certain kind of young American man, educated, restless, adventurous, idealistic, the idea of flying for France was the most intoxicating thing imaginable. This was the world that gave birth to the Lafayette Escadrille. Let's go back to the beginning. To understand how a group of American volunteers ended up flying French combat aircraft in 1916, you have to understand the strange diplomatic tightrope that everyone was walking. The United States was officially neutral. France desperately needed help. Not just in the trenches, where the casualties were already beyond comprehension, but in the air, where the Germans were beginning to establish a dangerous dominance. French military leadership had a problem and an opportunity at the same time. They couldn't officially recruit American citizens. That would be a diplomatic incident, potentially dragging the neutral United States into the war, or at minimum angering the Wilson administration. But they could look the other way while American volunteers found their own way into French service. The Foreign Legion had been accepting volunteers of all nationalities since the war began in 1914. It was the legal loophole. If you weren't in the French army proper, if you were technically a volunteer in the Legion, the French government had some diplomatic cover. Many Americans who wanted to fight had already gone this route, signing up for the Legion and finding themselves in the trenches. But a small group of them had a different idea. They didn't want to fight in the mud. They wanted to fly. The man most responsible for turning that idea into reality was Norman Prince. And if you've never heard his name, that itself is a small tragedy. Norman Prince was born in 1887 in Pride's Crossing, Massachusetts, into a wealthy, well-connected New England family. He had learned to fly before the war, had lived in France, and when the war broke out, he became consumed by a single idea: an American flying squadron, flying for France, composed of the best volunteer pilots America could produce. Prince began lobbying French military officials almost immediately. He wrote letters. He visited offices. He made arguments. He was, by all accounts, relentless. The French were skeptical at first. The diplomatic complications were real. But as the air war intensified and French losses mounted, the calculus began to change. And Prince wasn't the only one pushing. He found allies, particularly a man named Dr. Edmund Gros, an American physician living in Paris who had deep connections in both the American expatriate community and French government circles. Gros became the organizational backbone of what Prince had been dreaming about. Together, they navigated the bureaucratic maze of two governments, the political sensitivities of neutrality, and the practical challenge of finding young American men who could actually fly, or who could learn to fly quickly enough to be useful in combat. The first official meeting that led directly to the Lafayette Escadrille took place in late 1915. By early 1916, the French had agreed. The squadron would be formed. It would be called Escadrille Américaine, the American Squadron, and it would be assigned to the French Air Service, flying under French command, but composed entirely of American volunteers. Now, who were these men? This is where the story gets deeply human, deeply American in a particular way, and genuinely extraordinary. The founding pilots of what became the Lafayette Escadrille were not a random collection of adventurers. They were, in many ways, the cream of a certain stratum of American society. Many of them were wealthy, educated, from prominent families. This wasn't entirely a coincidence. Flying required money to learn, leisure time to practice, and the kind of freedom to make an unconventional life choice that poverty didn't allow. But within those parameters, they were remarkably diverse in personality, motivation, and background. Kiffin Rockwell was born in Newport, Tennessee, and raised in Asheville, North Carolina. He and his brother Paul had both enlisted in the Foreign Legion at the very beginning of the war, driven by a passionate belief that Germany's aggression against France and Belgium was simply wrong and had to be opposed. Kiffin was fierce, principled, almost puritanical in his commitment to the cause. He wasn't doing this for adventure. He was doing this because he believed it was right. When he was wounded in the trenches fighting with the Legion, he recovered and immediately sought to transfer to the Air Service. When the Lafayette Escadrille was formed, Kiffin Rockwell was one of its first and most important members. Victor Chapman was the son of John J. Chapman, a prominent New York writer and reformer. Victor had been living in Paris, studying art and architecture when the war began. Like Kiffin Rockwell, he had first served in the Foreign Legion Infantry before transferring to aviation. He was known for his extraordinary bravery, some said recklessness, and his almost cheerful indifference to danger. He was beloved by his fellow pilots. Elliott Cowden had been an accomplished amateur aviator before the war and was one of the few founding members who came to the squadron with real flying experience. He was older than many of his colleagues and brought a certain steadiness to the group. James McConnell was a University of Virginia man, a journalist by inclination, who would eventually write one of the most important first-hand accounts of the squadron's experience. He was thoughtful, literary, observant. He understood from the beginning that what they were doing was historically significant, and he was determined to document it. And then there was William Thaw. Thaw was a Pittsburgh millionaire's son who had learned to fly before the war and had actually been flying for France since 1915, even before the Escadrille was officially formed. He was one of the most experienced pilots in the group and would become one of its most important leaders. These were the core, but there were others, and the squadron would grow and change throughout its existence, with pilots rotating in and out, some dying, some transferring to other units, new volunteers arriving from America to take their places. The squadron was officially formed on April 20th, 1916. It was designated N-124 in the French Air Service, the number that would become legendary. And it was equipped with a Nieuport fighter, a French-designed aircraft that was at that moment one of the best fighter planes in the world. The Nieuport was fast, nimble, and a pleasure to fly by the standards of the time. It was also, like all aircraft of the period, terrifyingly fragile and unforgiving of mistakes. But before we follow these men into combat, I want to pause on something that is crucial to understanding what the Lafayette Escadrille actually was, what it meant, and why it mattered far beyond its military contribution. France in 1916 was a nation in crisis. The Battle of the Marne in 1914 had saved Paris, but at appalling cost. Then had come the trenches, hundreds of miles of them, stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border, filled with men dying by the hundreds of thousands for gains measured in yards. Verdun, which began in February of 1916, just as the Lafayette Escadrille was being formed, would become the longest battle in human history. 10 months of continuous fighting, over 700,000 casualties combined, a grinding slaughter that seemed designed not to win the war, but simply to destroy an entire generation of French and German manhood. France was exhausted, bleeding, and beginning to wonder whether it could survive. Into this darkness, the Lafayette Escadrille arrived like a ray of light. Not because a few dozen American pilots could turn the tide of a war that was consuming millions. They couldn't, and everyone knew it. But because of what their presence symbolized. America had not forgotten France. France, which had helped the American colonies win their independence from Britain, which had given America the Statue of Liberty, which represented in the minds of educated people everywhere a certain idea of civilization and liberty and human achievement. France had not been abandoned. There were Americans who cared, Americans who were willing to die. The French press went wild. The American volunteers were heroes before they had fired a single shot in combat. They were photographed, interviewed, celebrated at parties, introduced to generals and politicians and artists. The propaganda value was incalculable. Here were young Americans, sons of a new world, come to fight for the ideals that France and America shared. The Kaiser's Germany had been portraying the war as a simple matter of national interest and power politics. The Lafayette Escadrille complicated that narrative dramatically. And then they went to war. The squadron's first significant action came quickly after its formation, and it was not long before it drew its first blood and suffered its first losses. The air war over the Western Front in 1916 was nothing like the romantic image that newspapers painted. Yes, there was skill and individual daring. Yes, there were the legendary dogfights, the Fokkers and Nieuports weaving and diving and spinning through the sky while men on the ground below stopped and stared. But there was also sudden, random death. There was the engine that failed at 4,000 feet. There was the bullet that came from nowhere, from a direction you never saw. There was the fire, the worst thing, the thing all pilots feared most because parachutes were not standard equipment, and a plane on fire at altitude left you with only two choices, and neither of them was good. Kiffin Rockwell scored the squadron's first confirmed aerial victory on May 18, 1916, shooting down a German two-seater observation plane. It was a moment of tremendous significance, not just tactically, but symbolically. An American had drawn blood in a war his country was not officially fighting. Rockwell was celebrated, feted, written up in newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic. He wrote letters home about it that are remarkable for their honesty. He described the kill not with triumph, but with a kind of sober recognition of what he had done. He had ended a man's life. He believed it was necessary. He did not celebrate it. He simply did it and went back to flying. But the first major tragedy came even before the first victory had been properly celebrated. Victor Chapman, the art student from New York, the man who flew with cheerful recklessness, was shot down and killed on June 23, 1916. He was the first member of the Lafayette Escadrille to die in combat. He would not be the last. Chapman's death hit the squadron hard. These were not professional soldiers who had been trained to absorb loss as part of the routine. They were young men who had chosen to be here, who knew each other well, who had eaten meals together and played cards together and argued about politics together. Losing Victor Chapman meant something different from losing a conscript in a trench. It was personal, chosen, felt in a different way. And yet it did not break them. If anything, it deepened their commitment. They had skin in the game now, literally. To give up would be to make Victor's death meaningless. The summer of 1916 saw the squadron thrown into some of the most intense aerial combat of the entire war. The Battle of the Somme began on July 1st, the bloodiest single day in British military history, with nearly 60,000 British casualties in one day, and the air above the Western Front became increasingly savage. The Germans had their own elite pilots, including a man who would eventually become the most famous fighter ace of the war, Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron. The technology was improving on both sides. The tactics were evolving, and the volunteers of the Lafayette Escadrille were in the middle of it. Raoul Lufbery. I need to spend time on this man because he is, in many ways, the defining figure of the Lafayette Escadrille's combat identity. Gervais Raoul Lufbery was born in France in 1885, but had grown up in the United States and was considered an American. He had lived an extraordinary life before the war, traveling the world, working as a mechanic and acrobat, and whatever else presented itself, accumulating experiences that would have filled several ordinary lifetimes. He had been working as a mechanic for a French pilot named Marc Porp when the war began, and when Porp was killed in combat, Lufbery trained as a pilot himself, seemingly as an act of personal tribute. He was a natural. By the time Lufbery joined the Lafayette Escadrille in mid-1916, he already had combat experience, and he quickly established himself as something extraordinary, not just a competent pilot, not just a brave pilot, but a genuinely gifted aerial tactician. He understood the geometry of air combat in a way that few people of that era did. He developed what became known as the Lufbery Circle, a defensive formation in which aircraft flew in a circle so that each plane protected the tail of the one in front of it. It was one of the first genuinely sophisticated aerial combat tactics ever devised, and it saved lives. Lufbery would eventually be credited with 17 confirmed aerial victories, making him the highest-scoring ace of American nationality in the First World War. Though American nationality is complicated in his case given his Franco-American background, he was worshipped by his fellow pilots. He was patient, skilled, and seemingly fearless in the air. On the ground, he was quiet, self-contained, somewhat mysterious, a man who had lived too much of his life in motion to be entirely comfortable in one place. Throughout the fall of 1916, the squadron continued to fight and to lose. The losses accumulated with a terrible rhythm. Each one was a specific human being with a history and a family and a future that had been cut short. Norman Prince, the man who had dreamed the squadron into existence, who had lobbied and argued and refused to take no for an answer, was killed on October 15, 1916, not in combat, but in a landing accident after a successful mission. He had shot down an enemy plane that very day. He was returning home, victorious, and a landing gear clipped some telegraph wires in the dark, and the plane went down, and Prince was mortally injured. He died 3 days later, knowing the squadron he had created was flying above him. The cruelty of that particular death, so close to safety after a successful mission, not from enemy fire but from a wire in the dark, is almost too much to bear. And yet it was entirely characteristic of how the First World War killed people. It was not poetic. It was not proportional to the heroism that preceded it. It was simply random, mechanical, final. By this point, the squadron had come to the attention of the entire English-speaking world. American newspapers were publishing regular dispatches from the front. James McConnell, who had the journalist's instinct for the telling detail, was writing accounts that captured not just the heroism, but the ordinary daily life of the pilots. The card games, the wine, the mascots they kept. The squadron had 2 lion cubs named Whiskey and Soda, which they walked on leashes like dogs, and which apparently terrified the French mechanics. The arguments, the silences before a mission, the strange peace of being above the clouds. The lion cubs deserve more than a passing mention, because they say something important about the psychological life of the squadron. Whiskey and Soda were acquired as cubs early in the squadron's existence, and they grew into full-sized lions while living at the Escadrille's various bases. They were played with, wrestled with, taken for walks, allowed to wander into the barracks, and sleep on pilots' beds. Several pilots described Whiskey and Soda as genuine emotional anchors, creatures of uncomplicated affection in an environment saturated with danger and death. When you just come back from watching your friend's plane go down in flames, there is something restorative about a lion cub falling asleep on your feet. The squadron's name changed in December of 1916. The original name, Escadrille Américaine, had been causing diplomatic problems. Germany had complained formally to the United States that France was using the name to imply American government support for the Allied cause, which was a violation of American neutrality. The Wilson administration, which genuinely wanted to stay out of the war, made quiet representations to the French, and so the name was changed. It became the Escadrille Lafayette, the Lafayette Squadron, named after the Marquis de Lafayette, the French aristocrat who had fought alongside George Washington during the American Revolution. It was a brilliant choice. Lafayette was equally beloved in France and America, a symbol of the friendship between the two nations that went back to the founding of the Republic. The new name said, "We are not here officially, but we are here in the spirit of a friendship that is older than any of this." The year 1917 brought enormous changes to the war and to the Escadrille. Russia was collapsing into revolution. The British and French armies had suffered losses that were beginning to undermine their ability to maintain the offensive. And in April of 1917, the United States finally entered the war. Woodrow Wilson had tried everything to stay out of it. He had negotiated, protested, sent diplomatic notes, warned, begged. But Germany's decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking any ship, including American ones, that it found in the waters around Britain, combined with the revelation of the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany had proposed a military alliance with Mexico against the United States, had finally made neutrality politically impossible. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. For the Lafayette Escadrille, this was a moment of profound complexity. On one hand, it vindicated everything they had done. Their country had finally joined the cause they had been fighting for. The French government threw celebrations. Politicians made speeches. The newspapers compared the volunteer pilots to the founding fathers, to the sons of liberty, to every heroic archetype in the American national story. But on the other hand, what now? The United States Army Air Service was being built essentially from scratch. It had almost no experienced combat pilots, no real combat aircraft of its own, no infrastructure for aerial warfare remotely comparable to what France or Britain had developed over 3 years of brutal trial and error. The experienced pilots of the Lafayette Escadrille represented an enormously valuable resource. Men who had actually fought in the modern air war, who had developed tactics and skills that existed nowhere else in the American military. The transition of the Lafayette Escadrille into the American military structure was both inevitable and complicated. The squadron was formally transferred to the United States Army Air Service on February 18, 1918, and redesignated as the 103rd Pursuit Squadron, the first American pursuit squadron to fly in combat in the First World War. Most of the surviving Lafayette pilots transferred with it, though the transition was not always smooth. American military bureaucracy, suddenly confronted with men who had been fighting for 2 years under French command, wasn't always sure what to do with them. Some of the pilots found the adjustment genuinely difficult. They had been operating with a degree of autonomy and mutual respect within the French system that the American Army's more rigid hierarchy sometimes struggled to accommodate. But the more important legacy was this: the experienced pilots of the Lafayette Escadrille fanned out across the rapidly expanding American Air Service, sharing their knowledge, training new pilots, establishing the tactics and culture that would define American aerial combat for the rest of the war. They were the seed corn of American air power in the First World War. Without them, the learning curve for American pilots would have been far steeper and the casualties far higher. Raoul Lufbery himself was made a major in the United States Army Air Service and took on a crucial training role, working with the first American pursuit groups to arrive in France. He was deeply committed to passing on everything he had learned. He knew better than anyone how much a new pilot needed to know to survive, and he threw himself into the teaching role with the same intensity he had brought to combat. But Lufbery's own end was approaching, and it came in the most terrible way imaginable. On May 19, 1918, Lufbery took off from his airfield near Toul to intercept a German reconnaissance plane that had been spotted over the lines. He engaged the enemy aircraft at low altitude. His own plane caught fire. And then, what happened next became one of the most discussed and debated moments in American aviation history. Lufbery jumped from his burning aircraft. Some say he jumped intentionally to avoid burning to death, choosing a quicker end. Some say he fell. Some say he was trying to reach a small stream he might have seen below. He was at about 200 feet when he left the aircraft. He fell into a garden near the village of Marin, France, and was killed instantly. He was 33 years old. The death of Raoul Lufbery was mourned throughout the Allied world. He was one of the most celebrated American heroes of the entire war. President Wilson sent condolences. The French government awarded him posthumous honors. His fellow pilots, the men he had trained and inspired and protected, were devastated. He was buried in France, in the land he had chosen to fight for, and a portion of his ashes were later scattered over the Lafayette Escadrille's airfield, which itself tells you something about the depth of feeling he inspired. Let's step back and think about the broader legacy of all these men. Not just the aces, not just the famous ones, but all of them. The Lafayette Flying Corps, which is the broader term for all Americans who flew for France before the United States entered the war, of which the Lafayette Escadrille was the most famous component, eventually included approximately 267 pilots in total. Of these, 68 were killed in action or in flying accidents. That is an almost incomprehensible casualty rate. More than 1 in 4 died, and this was entirely voluntary. These men chose this. What drove them? We have their letters, their memoirs, their diaries. We have James McConnell's book, Flying for France, published in 1917, which remains one of the finest first-hand accounts of aerial combat in the First World War. We have Kiffin Rockwell's letters to his family, which are extraordinary for their moral clarity and emotional honesty. We have the recollections of survivors, gathered years later when the men who had lived through it tried to make sense of what they had done and why. The motivations were genuinely varied. Some, like Kiffin Rockwell, were driven by a passionate moral conviction that German aggression had to be opposed, that France and the values it represented deserved to be defended. Some are driven by a love of France, specifically France the country, France the culture, France the Paris they had known as students or tourists, France the idea. Some were driven by a love of flying, by the intoxicating freedom of the sky and the terrible beauty of aerial combat. Some were driven by something harder to name, a restlessness, a need for meaning, a sense that their comfortable American lives were too small for something in them that needed more. What they shared, almost universally, was a sense of responsibility to something larger than themselves. They were not naive, or at least they quickly stopped being naive once they had seen combat and watched friends die. They understood the cost. They paid the cost, and they kept flying. There is a particular story from the Lafayette Escadrille that I want to tell you, because I think it captures something essential about what these men were. It is the story of Kiffin Rockwell's death, which came on September 23, 1916, making him the third member of the Escadrille to be killed in combat. Rockwell had been flying a patrol and encountered German aircraft over the lines. He attacked, as he always attacked, directly, aggressively, without hesitation. A German bullet hit him in the upper chest, likely killing him instantly. His plane spiraled down and crashed behind French lines. When his fellow pilots and the French mechanics who had worked on his aircraft gathered to mourn him, something remarkable happened. The French commanding officer of the sector in which Rockwell had been flying sent a formal message of condolence that described him as the best soldier in the Lafayette Escadrille. Not the best pilot, the best soldier. Because for the French, who had been fighting and dying for 2 years already, the distinction mattered. Rockwell hadn't just been skilled. He had been committed in the deepest possible sense to their cause and their survival. His brother Paul, who had fought in the Foreign Legion Infantry and had been wounded and was now a war correspondent, received the news and sat down and wrote a letter to their mother that is one of the most heartbreaking documents of the entire war. He wrote about his brother's courage, about his conviction, about the rightness of what he had died for. But you can feel, underneath the formal language, the grief of a brother who had now lost the person closest to him in the world. Kiffin Rockwell was buried in France, as so many of the Lafayette Escadrille were buried, far from home, in the country they had chosen to defend. Now let's talk about the aircraft, because the aircraft are inseparable from the story, and because the technology itself tells us something important about the world these men inhabited. When the Lafayette Escadrille was formed in the spring of 1916, it was equipped with a Nieuport 11, a small, fast, single-seat biplane that the French called the BB, the Baby. It was one of the finest fighter aircraft of its era, capable of speeds approaching 100 miles an hour and possessing excellent maneuverability. It was armed with a single Lewis gun mounted on the top wing, firing over the propeller arc, and an elegant solution to the problem of shooting forward from a propeller-driven aircraft, but an effective one. The problem with the Nieuport 11, and with all the aircraft these men flew, was fragility. The wings were braced with wire. The fuselage was fabric over wooden frame. The engine was a rotary type. The entire engine rotated with the propeller, which made the aircraft both fast and extraordinarily difficult to control at low speeds. A spin in a Nieuport could be fatal simply because the gyroscopic effect of the rotating engine made recovery difficult even for experienced pilots. Inexperienced pilots were exactly what most of the Lafayette volunteers were not when they first climbed into their aircraft. Later in the squadron's history, they transitioned to the Escadrille, a French fighter aircraft that was in many ways the opposite of the Nieuport. Where the Nieuport was nimble but fragile, the Escadrille was heavier, more rugged, faster in a straight line. The transition required adjustment, and not all pilots managed it equally well. But the Escadrille became the aircraft of choice for the finest pilots of the war's final phase, and Lufbery in particular scored many of his victories in it. The airfields these men operated for were primitive by almost any standard. A field is exactly what they were, literally flat fields, either natural or minimally prepared, from which the aircraft would take off and land on grass. The pilots lived in whatever buildings were nearby: farmhouses, barns, converted stables. The mess where they ate was often a simple wooden structure hastily erected near the field. The whole operation had a quality of improvisation, of making do, that was both charming and dangerous. Equipment that broke down in the field had to be repaired on the spot, often with whatever materials were available, by mechanics who were themselves learning the work as they went. And yet from these improvised fields, these men flew into some of the most intense aerial combat in history. They flew in all weather, in rain that soaked their goggles and turned the cockpit into a cold waterfall, in cold that froze the oil in their engines and the fingers on their controls, in winds that could throw a small biplane about like a leaf. They flew with no radio communication. All signals were visual, hand gestures, wing waggles. They flew without parachutes in most cases, partly from a bizarre military doctrine that held that pilots who had parachutes would abandon their aircraft too readily. The courage this required, the courage to fly into combat, knowing that if your plane caught fire you had essentially no options, is almost impossible to fully comprehend from the comfort of the present. As 1917 progressed and the United States finally entered the war, the attention of the American press and public shifted. The Lafayette Escadrille was no longer the only game in town. American soldiers were arriving in France in increasing numbers. The American Expeditionary Forces under General Pershing were beginning to make their presence felt. The story of American involvement in the war was growing beyond the romantic tale of a few dozen volunteer pilots. But the pilots themselves remained central to American military aviation's development. When the 103rd Pursuit Squadron was formally constituted from the old Lafayette Escadrille, and when other Lafayette Flying Corps veterans spread through the new American air units, they brought with them something that could not be manufactured quickly: actual combat experience. They knew what it was like to face a Fokker or an Albatros with an experienced German pilot behind the guns. They knew the angles and the tactics, the mistakes that killed you and the habits that kept you alive. They were irreplaceable, and the American military, to its credit, generally understood this and used them accordingly. One man who deserves special mention in this context is Didier Masson, who had an almost uniquely unusual background, even within the extraordinary company of the Lafayette Flying Corps. Masson was born in France, but had become an American citizen, and before the war he had actually flown combat missions in a completely different context. In Mexico, during the Mexican Revolution, where he had flown for a Mexican revolutionary general in 1913. This made him one of the very first men in history to fly in actual combat. He brought a perspective that was unique even among the veterans of the Escadrille. He had been in aerial combat before most of them had ever sat in a cockpit. Then there is the story of the squadron's African-American applicants, which is a part of the Lafayette Escadrille story that is often left out and should not be. Several African-American men attempted to join the Lafayette Flying Corps during the war, motivated by the same idealism and sense of duty that had drawn the white volunteers. The French military, which had its own racial attitudes and complications, was in some cases more receptive to black volunteers than the American military of the time would have been. France had a long tradition of using African and Caribbean troops in its armed forces. But the pathway was not easy, and the discrimination these men faced, even in this context, was real. The story of black Americans and military aviation in this period is in many ways a preview of the story of the Tuskegee Airmen in the Second World War, a story of exceptional people fighting two battles simultaneously, one against the enemy and one against their own nation's prejudice. Let me take you now to the memorial, because the story of the Lafayette Escadrille does not end with the armistice in November of 1918. The surviving pilots went home, or most of them did. Some stayed in France, having found in that country something they couldn't leave behind. Some went on to distinguished careers in aviation, in business, and public life. Some struggled with what they had seen and done, with the adjustment back to civilian existence, with the silence where the engine noise had been. But the memory of the fallen, of Victor Chapman, Kiffin Rockwell, Norman Prince, James McConnell, Raoul Lufbery, and all the others, demanded some form of permanent recognition. And so there is at Marnes-la-Coquette near Paris, the Lafayette Escadrille Memorial. It was built in the 1920s, funded partly by private donations and partly by the French government, and it stands as one of the most moving war memorials in existence. It is a large stone structure built in a neoclassical style, with a crypt beneath that contains the remains of many of the American volunteers who died in France. Above the crypt is a statue of Lafayette himself, the Frenchman who had given so much for American independence, watching over the Americans who had given so much for France. The memorial was dedicated in July of 1928 in a ceremony attended by thousands of people from both countries, including surviving members of the squadron. It was a moment of formal recognition that these men had mattered, that what they had done would be remembered. But memory, as we know, is imperfect and impermanent. The Lafayette Escadrille has faded from the general American historical consciousness in a way that is somewhat remarkable given how celebrated these men were in their own time. Ask most Americans today who Kiffin Rockwell was, and you'll get a blank look. Ask them about Raoul Lufbery, about Norman Prince, about Victor Chapman, and the same blankness will likely greet you. The First World War itself has receded in American memory, overshadowed by the Second. And within the First World War, American participation has a narrower place in public memory than the participation of France or Britain or Germany, for whom the war was far more defining. This is part of why their story matters so much to tell, because these were remarkable people who did a remarkable thing, and the forgetting of them is a kind of injustice. What they did, to bring it back to the simplest possible terms, was to choose. In a world full of people who looked at the greatest catastrophe of their era and found reasons to stand aside, these young men chose to act. They chose at cost to themselves, at risk of death, at distance from family and country and safety. They chose France. They chose the cause of civilization against the forces that were trying to destroy it. They chose the sky, and they paid for that choice. 68 of them paid with their lives. The survivors paid in other ways, in nightmares, in the weight of what they had seen, in the friends they had buried in foreign soil. The price of their idealism was real and terrible, and they knew it going in, and they paid it anyway. The Lafayette Escadrille reminds us that history is not only made by nations and governments and armies. It is made by individuals who decide that something matters enough to act. It is made by young men who fly toward the sound of guns when they could be walking away. It is made by the Norman princes who spend years arguing for an idea that most people think is impractical and then live just long enough to see it become real. It is made by the Kiffin Rockwells who believe in justice so completely that they are willing to die for it in a country that is not their own. It is made by the Raoul Lufberys who are so good at something, who understand it so deeply, that they feel a responsibility to share that understanding with the next generation of fighters, even at the cost of their own safety. These men were Americans. They were also, in a real sense, citizens of something larger than America, citizens of an idea about what human civilization should be and what it was worth fighting for. They crossed an ocean to defend that idea, and the world they helped preserve, imperfect as it was, imperfect as it remains, is the world we inhabit today. Every time you see an aircraft in the sky, think of them. Think of the Newport biplanes climbing into the overcast above the Western Front, the wire singing in the wind, the engine roaring, the men inside them knowing that the next few minutes might be their last. Think of what it took to be that young and that brave and that certain that something mattered enough to die for. Think of Kiffin Rockwell over the Vosges Mountains, banking his Newport into a diving attack. Every nerve and instinct alive in a way that ordinary life rarely achieves. Think of Raoul Lufbery circling above the clouds, patient and watchful, the finest natural warrior of his generation, waiting for the moment that only he could see. Think of Norman Prince, lying in a hospital bed after his last successful mission, knowing he was dying, knowing that the thing he had worked hardest for in his life was flying above him even as he lay still. Think of Victor Chapman, diving through anti-aircraft fire to bring oranges to a wounded comrade on the ground, because that was who he was, because the war had not made him careful, had not taught him to hold anything back. These were Americans. This was their choice, and it changed the world. Here is a question I want to leave with you today. We live in a time when the challenges facing civilization, though different in form from the challenges of 1916, are real and serious and demand response. The Lafayette Escadrille were ordinary young men, mostly, who looked at an extraordinary situation and decided they could not stand aside. They didn't wait for their government to act. They didn't wait for permission. They acted from conscience, from conviction, from love, of France, of freedom, of something they believed in more than they believed in their own safety. So here's my question for you. What would it take? What cause, what injustice, what threat to the things you value would move you to cross your own ocean? Not necessarily literally, but what would move you to act when acting is hard, when the cost is real, when no one is making you? The men of the Lafayette Escadrille answered that question with their lives. How would you answer it? Think about it. Share your answer in the comments. Because this conversation about courage, about conscience, about what we owe to each other and to civilization itself is one that never stops being relevant. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you of something important, do one thing before you leave today. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because stories like this one deserve to be remembered.